Welcome everyone to a special edition of Kudomusicology, a Ludomusicology Literature review. I am your host, Musicologess, and this is a special week because our book is out. Whoa!
Yay.
There's a picture of it right here. This is what the cover looks like. Also, here's a copy. I have two more. It's very exciting. So the intersection of animation, video games, and music will be out by the time this video is playing. It officially goes to print tomorrow, but it is already in the hands of the contributors, and I know several libraries have pre-ordered as well. I've had a few folks tell me that their libraries have gotten both ebook and digital copies for their students, and paper copies for their students to use. So with me today on the, I always say podcast, on the stream is Lisa Scoggin, my co-editor who brought me into this process and allowed me to tag along. So welcome, Lisa. It's so good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm enjoying this.
So, where did this book come from? Because I was not at the inception.
So basically what happened is that I had been to a number of different conferences, the Ludomusicology conferences, the Music and Moving Image conference, the Society for Animation Studies conference, and there were a lot of different papers and just discussion on the intersection of mostly, well, either animation and music or video games and music or animation and video games. And then, so that just seemed like it was a topic that a lot of people were interested in and had started to really think about, but that nobody had really written or published on. And so I thought, this seems like it might be an interesting topic for a book, and a lot of people might find it interesting or want to write about it and want to talk about it. So I put the idea out there, and yes, people were actually very excited about it. And then I brought you on. So you were on there pretty early in the whole idea process.
Yeah, I remember you had sort of started a proposal to Routledge, the publisher. It's not like we shopped this around. We pitched it to them and went through responding to the readers. The reviews were really positive, I remember, and just really an agreement that this book seemed like a good fit and was timely, and go forth and recruit the authors. So yeah, we met. I'm trying to remember if we met at Music and the Moving Image or if we met when you came to the North American Conference on Video Game Music the first time. I don't remember exactly. At this point,
I think that the two of us met before that, because I remember you telling me about the North American. I can never remember what order the words are. I'm sorry.
North American Conference on Video Game Music.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's one of those fun acronyms.
It's too long. NECVGM.
But I think we met at Music and the Moving Image because you had told me about the North American Conference in Video Game Music. And so that's how I got involved in that. And that's how I started to learn a little bit more about video games and video game music, because although I play lots of video games myself, really I'm coming at this more from the animation and the music side of things, which is part of why I think we made such a great team, is because you have such a strong knowledge of video games and video game music, and so we were able to work together well that way.
Yeah, it was nice to sort of have both specialties. We'll get into some of the editing in a minute here, but I did feel like we complemented each other really well, and we were very much of the same mind in terms of feedback for the authors, and I think that they saw a unified front in a lot of places there. So I think that was a really, really lucky working scenario for all of us. So you mentioned that you've played a bunch of video games. What's sort of your history with video game playing? What was sort of the first stuff you remember playing, and what got you into gaming?
Oh, gads, I'm going to show my age. So Zork, the original, back on like the TRS-80, like when it came out. That tells you how old I am.
So not a console gamer in the beginning.
No, not a console gamer at the beginning. A lot of PC games. my parents were very much PC people, and they didn't really understand the concept of consoles. So the console games came later, either from visiting friends and playing a little bit on their machines, or once I got into, I would say, grad school, really, then I started to do more of the console games because then I could afford to purchase my own console. And before that, it was mostly PC stuff.
That's awesome. I had kind of the opposite trajectory in that my brother brought home the NES, early 90s, I think. So it wasn't right when it came out. He begged for a long time to have a Nintendo because everyone at school had a Nintendo. So I sort of remember having a Nintendo first and then a Super Nintendo and then maybe a Sega Genesis, but sort of after that it got really expensive to keep up with the console, so we switched to PC gaming. So PC gaming was like middle school for me. We got a Gateway PC back when those were like all the rage with like the cow print everything. And so I started mostly the same types of games I was doing on console, like a lot of role-playing games. I did Final Fantasy 7 and 8 on PC instead of on console, so I don't find that at all unusual. And surprisingly, there's not a lot of people that write about the early PC games in Ludo, and I think part of that is just because it really depends on your specific computer build. So the same game would sound very different depending on the sound hardware that was included on your PC. And I think that that's part of the problem is we've had like, what do you do with a game that inherently sounds so different? So
Yeah.
interesting
No, I remember
stuff.
I remember Zork mostly being the sounds of my typing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So not all of them had sound either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's always interesting. So I don't think I actually know your musical background. What's your instrument? What did you?
So I have a master's in tuba performance.
Tuba. Wow, I
Yes.
had no idea.
Yep. Yeah, and I took several courses. Well, I started my DMA in tuba and then switched over to musicology about halfway through, which um, generally don't recommend because that means that you're adding a lot of extra time to being in school. But um, I mean, I learned a lot about listening to music and listening to sounds, and, especially being a tuba player, because the way that you fit into the orchestra, you're that that bottom level, and everybody needs to build on top of you. So you have to listen to how you fit within the rest of the structure and how the rest of the structure fits into you.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I think it's really helped me with my analysis of things, just to be able to figure out how things work and how the music, continues onward and where it's going and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Did you feel when you switched to music? You mentioned it adding more time. Did you feel kind of behind, not having like a master's in musicology? That was an issue that I had having a master's in violin, where I was like, oh no, I've never written a thesis.
No, I mean, I was probably a double degree in all but name when I was doing my master's anyway, because I was, like taking courses in. I had an independent study on Shostakovich, and I like was, doing all kinds of creation of. I created a syllabus for some strange reason as part of the study, and just what kinds of materials are out there, and so there were a lot of things that I was just doing because I thought it would be fun. So it's kind of a little bit of a mixed thing anyway, what I was doing for my master's, and then so it made sense for me to switch over to the PhD program.
Oh, I love that. And it all just kind of looped around and found a place. And that's how I was actually visiting Jessica Getman's class this morning, um, via Zoom. And we were talking about this idea that you sort of take this windy path and you start seeing like, oh yeah, this is kind of where I was meant to end up, because I was in a conservatory environment. I didn't have the money to get a better violin, so I knew like how much am I going to be able to compete on the audition circuit. no matter how much I practice. And I was already feeling behind because I wasn't a Suzuki kid. And yeah, just coming into music history and going, oh, I like reading and writing and academics, and I've always taken too many foreign languages where, beyond the requirements, where my advisors would be like, why are you still in German? You don't need to be. So when I started realizing, oh, this is what musicologists often do, it sort of all made sense. But I know I definitely worried about that switch, not having the master's in musicology and going, am I going to be able to write a dissertation? But I think everybody has that feeling, even if they have written a thesis. It just feels insurmountably large. So did you start the dissertation process already knowing that it was going to be cartoon music related, or like when did cartoon music come into the process? What is your dissertation on? See, I'm learning so much.
Well, I have never been at a university where at the time they had film music courses or video game music courses. So I am very much self-taught in that way. So my dissertation is on an opera by Mark Anthony Turnage, who's a British composer who's still around and composing. The opera is called The Silver Tassie, and it's basically an anti-war opera based on a Sean O'Casey play. And it talks about a lot of how the music shows that it's anti-war, not just the text. And then I trace back from basically the 20th century art music. I'm going to pause because I need to get some water.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, this is so interesting. I actually started my dissertation thinking I was going to write on opera, and I'd never even played in one. I just had a thing for minimalist opera and sort of thought I was going to write on glass. So this is really interesting to me.
Yeah. So I was basically taking that opera and then analyzing it for aspects that might be considered anti-war, and then taking those and comparing it to other anti-war artwork, British art music, starting with World War I and working my way forward. So it was really interesting, and there's a lot of really fascinating stuff, and I still like it, and I still listen to it and pay attention to some extent to the scholarship. But at the time that I was writing it, Daniel Goldmark had done his stuff, but that had been it. So it was one of those things where I don't think that honestly it was even something that occurred to me that I could write on music and animation. And I have a feeling that, I know it's a lot better now, but when I did my dissertation, I don't know that it necessarily would have been acceptable to write a dissertation on it for most people.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people probably would have been fine, and some of them would have been like, oh, no, you can't do that because you will never go anywhere. It's not an acceptable topic. And, I'm sure that other people who listen to this streaming have been in that kind of situation before.
Yeah. There are definitely folks who have faced that. Will Cheng, actually, when we were having the big wrap up of his book, was talking about this idea of sort of having to prove that video game music wasn't this juvenile entertainment, So I imagine that there has been a similar process where certainly a lot of genre work is still excluded in film studies. Like I haven't seen much work on like romantic comedy. Somebody that was a couple cohorts behind me at Ohio State actually wrote a dissertation on it. But I really haven't seen a ton of work on like a lot of different subgenres of film because they're like not as serious. And yeah, it's getting better. The field has to kind of establish first and become as I open my seltzer and it makes noise. The field has to establish and get acceptable sort of to the musicology writ large, and then we can start kind of pushing at these boundaries. And
I think it is getting better. So there have been, there was a volume that came out in American Music that was all about Disney last year. I think it came out. So, and then I've seen a lot more writing from some established scholars who are like, oh, you mean I can write about the stuff that I love?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that they love what they do anyway. They love, the classical music and that kind of stuff. But I don't think that it's now becoming more acceptable for a lot of people. And they're like, oh, well, now that I'm an established person, I'm going to write on the cartoons that I enjoyed watching when I was a kid, or,
Mm-hmm.
anything else like that. So it's nice to see that it's starting to expand, and also some of the scholars that are, kind of more up and coming, don't necessarily have that same type of mindset, at least from what I've seen, of, oh no, you can't write on that. You have to write on Beethoven or Bach, or, so that the canon is able to expand, and people are who are in places where they're, either tenure track or they're getting tenure, or are able to show the rest of the world that yes, this is acceptable.
Yeah. Okay, then so how did animation enter the picture for you? How did you start getting involved with like music in the moving image and SCMS and all of
So
these places?
so music in the moving image, my first paper was actually on Sondheim Sweeney Todd. So I was comparing the movie version that just come out,
Mm.
which is a very different beast than the actual,
Yeah.
original Broadway show. And so I took those two and kind of compared them, and what does that mean in terms of, these different changes and the how that affects the meaning of the work as a whole. And then that going there kind of opened my eyes to, ooh, look at all these different things that people are writing about. And then there were a few different papers. That was a while ago. But there were some papers and other things that I saw. Oh, look, people are actually writing on this. That's really exciting. I can write on music and animation. Yay! So I did, and I do have to say that while I certainly appreciate people writing, wanting to take everything seriously, for me, um, part of the joy is not necessarily feeling like I have to, but that might also be because I'm an independent scholar, and so I have that ability to just, okay, well, I'm going to write on this because I enjoy it, and if I'm finding the joy as a child would, then that's okay.
Yeah, I love that. I was just talking to somebody, a dance scholar friend of mine, about um, this idea of being shocked that anybody reads my work, and saying like one level I have the luxury of not really having to care about citations or placement, prestige of where I'm publishing, and I can kind of just follow my passions and not have to be as strategic because I'm not on that tenure clock looking to get a certain number of publications in a certain type of place. Um, and I joked, I'm like, does that make up for the precariousness of being outside of the institutions? Like, no, not really, but but
Well,
the work itself is so rewarding, and it's almost like how a lot of people describe post tenure to me, where they feel like, oh, I can breathe and just focus on the things I want to focus on. I've been able to do a little bit of that from the beginning, so that side of it has been really rewarding and freeing.
yeah, it's an interesting balance because I'm able to do what I want to, but because that's not my job and I have an actual 9 to 5 job, then I have to balance out the rest of my life with that. And then I don't have the same kind of library access that somebody who is a professor at a university does, and I have to either do a lot of stuff on my own, or I have to ask friends for help, or you know see if there are libraries nearby that I can basically buy a membership to, kind of.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's always a balance between what's good and what's bad, I think, for tenure track or for an independent scholar.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenges are different. I've enjoyed the path so far, and I have a toe at least in adjuncting, so I tend to get kind of limited access to libraries, although from afar. So I can't go into a library, but I can usually at least get JSTOR access, which that does a lot. That does a whole lot. But yeah, I definitely am reaching out if Hartford doesn't have, being a smaller school, it doesn't have access to everything. So there are a lot of journals where I'm like, does anybody have access to this? And then we just kind of make it work for each other. All right. Well, that's I'm learning so much about your history here. So kind of when I think where most of the folks in Ludo started to really pay attention to your work is when you brought the Cuphead paper. So that was that 2019? I'm trying to remember what year it was.
It was at Hartford.
Okay, so yeah, that was 2019. Wow,
Okay.
that was the last year we were in person for a while. Yeah, and everyone was absolutely floored by it. Not only because, here we have this expert in cartoon music that's able to speak to this game that is done in cell animation. You're the perfect person to do the work. But you mentioned that you beat the game. So all these hardcore gamers in the audience were like, whoa, I still haven't beaten the game.
No, and I have to say, I didn't quite beat the game. I got to the last bit, when they were fighting the devil's right-hand man. I didn't beat that.
Okay.
So that makes you feel
you got a lot further than I have. Because that is a real slog. That must have taken just absolute ages.
Well, it's one of those things. The levels are short. If the levels were not short, then there was no way that I would have gotten very far in that game. Because it was just one of those things. For that, I feel like once you learn the patterns of things, it makes it a lot easier. But you just have to figure out the patterns, and then you're okay. It's like all those 1980s games that it's modeled after, right?
Yep. And that's it. We hadn't seen games that type of hard. There's always been a threat of them, and but yeah, I think there's been a lot of indie games that have been incredibly difficult and kind of valorized that difficulty. Super Meat Boy is another one that comes to mind where I've never gotten far in that one either because it's just punishingly difficult. And Cuphead doesn't really have easy mode, if I recall. They may have added it since the last time I played, but
they do have an easy mode, but you can't get. You can only do that for the first 3 islands, and the DLC. If there's an easy mode, I haven't found it. The DLC is, challenging.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. So I'll do some summary of that chapter. Just wonderful recreations of 1930, well, kind of a mishmash of early jazz and ragtime and barbershop and all of these different things. And what I really like about your chapter is you allow space to have unanswered questions at the end, and you sort of end with these cliffhangers. So we'll get to that in a little bit when I when I go to my summary portion of the day. But the book itself. So we went through the process of working on the proposal, getting that all squared away, and then we had our contributors in hand with the proposal, if I recall, at least names, right? I'm sort of trying to remember our chronology here, because I think we had a list of all the chapters and maybe abstracts.
So what? Because I had spoken with the Routledge editor before. She had always been very nice to me and very encouraging, even though I'm not, a tenure track professor, which I really appreciate, because that doesn't always happen.
Mm-hmm.
So she had said, okay, this is kind of the process, and she said, the best thing to do is to kind of line up the contributors and get summaries of things before you do the final submission, because that way they have a better idea of really what's in the book and whether they're going to take it. So we reached out. I think we already had a few people perhaps in mind.
Mm-hmm. And I remember the call for papers that we sent out through a few different channels. So We
Yeah.
were able to get definitely some names that were new to me. Because I certainly knew some of the Ludo folk and, was able to recruit at least one. But um, yeah, a lot of names that were new to me. And that was really, really exciting to get to work with people that were sort of outside my little circle.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I really like about the book is that there are some people who are much more, music experts, some people who are really animation is their big thing, some people where video games are really their big thing. And so each person is able to bring in a different perspective, which is a really nice thing, I think, to have in a collection.
Yeah. And in that process, we were pretty careful in the editing phase to make sure that there wasn't sort of neglecting one of the three areas. We really wanted every single chapter to really triangulate animation, video games, music. And so any time that there was really an emphasis on one or the other, we were sort of like, okay, bring this in a little more, try this. So I think what's nice is every chapter sort of has that balance, and that makes the entire volume feel so much more cohesive as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess let me pull up I wonder if I can get this on stream. Maybe not. The page that lists everything. Oh, that's the video game page. That's not the one I wanted. Okay. Yeah, so, and we actually, both of us, I think, didn't really know what we were going to write in this book. And, like, at least not at the outset. I was kind of vacillating between two ideas, and it was just a matter of what was going to end up fitting better. And it was all just sort of based on some of the feedback, of things that the readers wanted to see included. And I was, because Cuphead was not originally the plan, but I was so happy that you ended up doing Cuphead, only because I think it's just such a perfect representation of all three areas in this book. It seems like tailor-made for this book.
Yeah. I have had people ask me, so did the idea for the book come out of your paper? And I'm like, not really. Um, it just so happened that there were a lot of other people doing similar kinds of things at the same time. So, but yeah, it was nice. First of all, I'm really glad that we found readers that understood all those different aspects because a lot of the time, in my experience, whenever I'm presenting, there are people who are like, I love it, but I don't understand it, so I'm afraid to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Or people who are, well, here's an article, that's great, but I don't know who should review it for our journal. So it was nice that we found readers who took the time and were, understanding and responsive and gave us good feedback on it. But yeah, I think that we basically held back our chapters to some extent until they gave us the feedback, and then we were like, oh, okay, we'll use those to kind of fill in those gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the expertise, and I have enough knowledge of video games that we were able to do that.
Yeah. Because I sort of had something up my sleeve because that one of the areas they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just all old games, that there was some representation sort of across history, that we would be able to speak to. And so one of the areas I was thinking of was actually Spiritfarer, which the first time I played it, I was like, wow, this looks like a Disney movie. Like it has that sort of feel to it, even though I don't believe the animation wasn't done in the same way as it was in like Cuphead, but that was sort of a secondary area. I probably will come back to that one and develop it. There's things that I think I want to do with Spiritfarer, but I was really happy that our two chapters ended up being these kind of sister chapters, and that these are two video games that explicitly used hand-drawn cell animation. I mean, in the case of Cuphead, it was, of course, digitally hand-drawn in that sense. But, really the painted backdrops and just sort of in the direct lineage. And so Dragon's Lair is kind of the first one to do this, with the Laserdisc in the arcade in 1983. And really, we didn't see a lot of this style of animation for a long time. So um, it ends up coming back, and Cuphead ends up being like a nice connection there. And you even referenced Dragon's Lair at the beginning of the Cuphead chapter, sort of like we haven't really seen this in a while. So I really like how our two chapters played off of each other.
Yeah, well, it's hard to do because the way that animation works, you're going at a slower frame speed, and you basically, when you're playing the video games, you have to tell it and have it be very responsive, especially in a Cuphead-like game. If you're doing something that's more of the narrative game where it's okay, here's my text, and then I'm going to click on which way we're going to go from here, or then it's perhaps easier. But when you're doing something that's so responsive, and to have that much animation, because it takes a lot of work to do each one of those cells, that's it's hard to put together something like that that will still work for the player and still be responsive and understand, oh, look, the player is going to do something I wasn't expecting. Suddenly they're going to be heading in this weird direction, and now I have to have animation for it. Oh, so I can understand why there aren't very many of them out there.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things with the Dragon's Lair chapter, was how much of the animation was devoted to failure. To death. And part of that is just delighting in having all of these really, really gruesome and different deaths for Dirk. They could have just had a generic game over screen, the one where he turns into a skeleton. That could have just been the one that plays for everything. But a lot of the animation was given over to that because it's also the thing you saw the most, because the game was so hard. I remember attempting to play it as a kid in the arcade and like never getting past the first screen.
I imagine the animators had a lot of fun with it too.
Yeah, and especially coming out of that kind of Disney exodus too, and paving, Don Bluth and company paving this new path, and then thinking, oh, we don't necessarily have to be totally family friendly. We can make this a little like PG-13, knowing that a lot of teenagers will be in the arcade, and like, so we can still use the style, but what do we get to do with that? Having some of those constraints removed. And Cuphead similarly isn't necessarily aiming at like the youngest players. I don't think the difficulty alone would mean that you're not going to really get 6-year-olds playing that game.
Yeah, well, and the Moldenauers in an interview with Warren Spector actually said, that they were paying attention to some of the cartoons that were perhaps aimed at a little bit more of an adult audience anyway. If you look at some of those older cartoons, some of the Betty Boop ones, Betty Boop is not designed for 6-year-olds.
Right. Right, absolutely.
So it makes sense that the game itself also would be aimed for a little bit older, for not that E10 Lego video game grouping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have pulled up on the stream on the screen here the list of chapters, so everybody can see what the beautiful things in this book. And we will actually be featuring a number of these chapters on this very stream in future weeks. Some of the ones that are particularly video gamey, and folks who were available and willing to be on stream with me. So we had Andrew Powell writing on Epic Mickey, which is a really nice follow-up. We actually had Tim Summers on stream last summer talking about his work on like the Disney Fantasia games, and Epic Mickey is a nice follow-up to that. I like to think in terms of, hey, anybody designing a class, you could assign those two together. They would go really nice. Really nice together. I was really struck by Tristan Neschke's Rusted Red Machinarium as political allegory, because that game was new to me, but also the sort of entire history being told here in terms of the Czech animation in the Golden Age.
Yeah, and that's, Czech animation is fascinating, and there's so much really interesting stuff in the way it works, and a lot of it is, if you watch it, it's actually really accessible because a lot of it really doesn't use words so much. So but a lot of people in the United States have never heard of any of it. So I do think that's going to be an eye-opening chapter for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And a really interesting game too. That I've now seen a couple people let's play and demo on Twitch. So maybe it'll find its footing a little bit more because it's a smaller game, which I appreciated that we have some very canonic series represented here, but there's also some less shall we say like Mario-y type games in the mix here, and it's nice to see that because I know that's been a big push in Ludomusicology is like watching that canonization and making sure that we're speaking to a broad swath of games and what's possible. And a lot of the coolest things that are happening in indie spaces. But of course, being an animation book, we do have this like connection to Disney with Epic Mickey, with Ryan's Kingdom Hearts 3 chapter. So we do have that in there as well.
Yeah, and one other thing that I like to see, we have definitely some JRPG games that are in here, but it's not all that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think that will also help with the canon. I'm hoping it will help with the canon, because understandably there's a lot of beautiful music that's available for those, but it's not the only thing. So it's nice to see again that expansion, especially with Ludomusicology being a relatively young field before it all gets set in stone, to have people look at all kinds of things.
Yeah, nothing wrong with Koji Kondo. He's great. But it is nice to see these things, and some of the Japanese properties. The connection through anime means that they're not necessarily the Final Fantasy games, because a lot of our chapters in the later section of the book that kind of get into the media mix and things like that. It's Ni no Kuni, which of course is connected through Ghibli Studio.
I think
I asked this on stream like a couple weeks ago, and I don't remember.
That's all right. It's one of those words that I'm gonna just guess at, but
well, and it's one of those things you realize you've only seen it written most of the time. This happens to me all the time on stream, so I have no qualms not knowing how to pronounce words, but that's usually the case when I go to say it and then realize, oh, I've never said this out loud.
Yeah, I'll need to check with my friend who is an expert in movies from that studio, and they will let me know.
And I haven't seen a lot of them. Actually, Joe and I are kind of saving them until our daughter's a little older, because we want to sort of watch them with her. So I've really only seen a handful, but we're going to kind of like do those with her when she's a little bit older. And I can't wait. I think it's going to be really fun for me to be watching them the first time instead of always just showing her things that I already know.
Some of them will be good for the younger age. Some of them
some of them are old. Yeah. Yeah. Joe has a better finger on that pulse than I do, and I know that there's like My Neighbor Totoro is a big one with like the younger set, but yeah, some of them can get pretty dark. So beautiful though. So yeah, like I wasn't as familiar with things. I have a bit of a Japanese background. I minored in undergrad and haven't really maintained great language skills with it, but enough that have gotten me by for the types of work I've needed to do. So that was something that I was really happy to see, that I didn't necessarily know, like Stacy Jokoi's chapter on Rurouni Kenshin. I didn't know that at all, but I was able to at least speak to sort of the anime bits and the specifics of the Japanese language. And there were definitely moments in all of the anime chapters where folks that are very steeped in anime, there's sort of like tropes and understandings that we had to make sure that we were unpacking for an audience that didn't know that material. Like I don't even remember what chapter it was, but talking about like moe and sort of like, oh, we need to make sure that we like define this really carefully in like a footnote for folks.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that as an editor we both were really focusing on, was making sure that somebody from one audience, somebody, say if they're an anime scholar, then they would understand the rest of the chapters. They'd
Mm-hmm.
understand music heavy chapters, or the video game people would understand the animation scholars and so forth. Because as I said, I've presented and had people just sit there and go, I don't know exactly what you mean,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not that I'm trying to put in all of this different language, this not understandable. It's just that there's a lot of stuff there that maybe people aren't used to thinking about or listening to or hearing, or that kind of thing.
I've talked about that with students before, the kind of know your audience element. If you've been doing a conference paper, if I go to music in the moving image, and I'm doing particularly a game that isn't Mario, something really, really well known, I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time explaining the plot of the game, the gameplay mechanics, whereas there's things that can get shorthanded if I'm presenting that same paper at North American Conference on Video Game Music, where like I don't have to explain what a JRPG is, or some of these things. It's like they may need different unpacking in different contexts, and I think that was the nicest thing about having our specialties complement each other in this way, because I could kind of bring out the gamey things, and then a little bit of the Japanese stuff where I could help there. But we certainly had some folks in here with a lot more exposure to those areas. What I really liked about this process was how much it felt like a conversation with the authors instead of like a top-down authoritative, where the editors do this. Yeah, I don't know if that's something that you sort of felt was really vibrant and active in that process.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a collaboration. And I think part of it helps that we really kind of spelled out, these are the expectations. This is what we're going to do. This is a basic timeline. So really, putting that structure in place for people so that they knew kind of what to expect and could plan around it. And then, yeah, when we were doing the process, I felt like, the time that we spent on it and the amount of time and the deadlines and everything were perfectly reasonable. But I have learned since that not everybody has the same kinds of expectations around different things. So, so I think that, the timing of all of it, and, that we went through each item several times and, gave feedback multiple times on it and just fine-tuned it as we went, and, really tried to help people if they were having difficulties. Say, we had a few people who said, well, here's the first draft, it's really horrible. And we were able to take it and either go, no, it's actually perfectly fine.
Or sort of know, like, I see where you're going with this, maybe add this, here might be the missing link sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And, and we both had enough knowledge to go, maybe you want to look at some of these different people, or, some of this scholarship, so that that can maybe help inform your thought without writing it for them. Because that's the other thing that I've seen in not just editors but also in professors sometimes, where they're like, here, let me tell you exactly what to say. And to me, that really doesn't help. Then you're not really letting the person be who they need to be in their writing.
Yeah, I had a sense of take anything I say with a grain of salt, and if you find yourself really bristling, especially if it's a matter of language style, like it's very hard to assert your own voice, especially if you're an early career scholar. You sort of feel like, oh, the editor's telling me, my professor's telling me, my committee for my dissertation is telling me this, and I have to do it. And just having that sense of, no, like, you have instincts, and we're here to make suggestions, and for the most part, I felt like we were often very in alignment. Like, I can't even think of any moments where I super disagreed with you on anything. I think for the most part, it was whoever got to it first had the the more intense pass, and then like I sort of brought different. I have like a very copy editor brain, so I was good at a lot of like nitpicky little fixes and formatting and things like that.
And I was happy to let you do it.
It was nice to hone that a little bit, and I usually don't get to use the job that I have doing that. I mostly work outside my field, so I get a lot of stuff in the sciences and business. And so, I've
Yeah.
gotten good at finding it no matter what, but it was kind of nice to do it and know the other and be able to speak to content a little bit as well. But yeah, I felt like we sort of had a united front. I have done edited collections, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but like the role playing games collection, the Green Book, as a lot of people call it, although this is now a Green Book too. So we have a second Green Book, but the so called Green Book with Steve Raleigh and Will Gibbons, they submitted they did their own markup, so we would get 2 documents back, and sometimes because they hadn't seen what the other one had written, sometimes that was really really useful. Sometimes they had totally different suggestions, and you sort of had to sit there and go, okay, which one do I want to follow here? So it can work. It was just something that I sort of wondered about. Oh, maybe we could have a process where we see each other's comments and can either go, yeah, I agree with that, or just kind of add to it. So there was collaboration on that level, which could have affected, could slow down turnaround time because then we have to coordinate. Like there's definitely reasons to do it one way or the other. But I think that sort of helped the authors feel really comfortable with us and with our working relationship. And see some of the conversation, because like I even remember responding and like doing reply comments on yours, just agreeing or adding more. So there was that sense of communication, where even if somebody was going to be late getting a chapter to us, there wasn't just this, I'm just going to not say anything, I'm going to hide until they come after me. A lot of folks were pretty straightforward about what was going on, and at least reasonably able to estimate where things were, and I think that helped keep the book on track.
Yeah, I have to say our contributors were really good about communicating with us for the most part, and really open in terms of, again, suggestions more than you must do this. So very much that collaborative spirit, and very good about understanding, all right, I need to get this in here, and it might not be perfect because as much as I would like this to be a perfect book, I don't know that any book can ever be perfect.
I
So
already caught an error in my chapter, but it was before I got the hard copy.
so just that understanding of we're all going to do our best and we're going to work together to make the best product that we can. And it was a really nice collaborative effort with you, certainly, and then also with all of our contributors.
Yeah, I thought it was a really beautiful process, and that communication was something. The sense of really speaking to the collaborators and working with them, instead of having it be more top down, is something that I'm going to carry forward into any other editing that I do. I think it was really valuable. It was very, very relationship building. I did have a lot of people say afterwards they really liked working with the two of us. They felt that sense of ownership of the work, that it wasn't something they were being told what to do. There was space for them to have their own ideas and their own voice, and decide how to incorporate the feedback. And I think the chapters all have that sense of, again, there's that unifying thread of they all speak to all 3 elements, and we made sure of that, but then everybody really does have their own voice here.
Yeah, they definitely do. Although it's also really nice that the chapters that we got, we were able to kind of group them into the subtopics that we have. So, in terms of like that classroom stuff that you were talking about, if you have this particular topic, here are a couple of different chapters that you can throw in there, and they all do come from different points of view, and all speak with their own voice. Some people, I know that I tend to be a little bit more conversational in my writing, Some people are less so, and everybody was perfectly fine with whatever tone they needed to use to communicate properly.
Yeah, yeah, I felt that as well. There's such a range here of methodologies and topics and ultimately the writing styles, but it doesn't feel anything but cohesive to me in the end, which is really um, speaks a lot to the process and the communication and the relationship with everybody, but also I think that there's a piece of just luck in here. I just feel very fortunate. There were a lot of moments in this process that I felt like, wow, this is really just coming together. This particular grouping of people is just working. So
Yeah.
that feels like just a really unusually lucky first experience to do this.
Yeah, and I have to say, especially doing this through COVID times,
Yeah.
where, I mean, in some ways it was helpful in that people were home, but it's hard to get resources when you can't go to the library.
Mm-hmm.
So that we were able to do this through COVID and still get in our manuscript on time really says something about everybody who was involved in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody was wonderful. And again, the communication meant that if somebody had, and we had folks have all kinds of different things come up in their personal lives, medically and otherwise, where they were just like a semester that had really gone off the rails because students were struggling with the online learning. People had family care responsibilities. Like we were all balancing these things in COVID. And as soon as someone was saying, oh, I think my chapter's going to, this draft of it's going to be 2 weeks late or a month late, that allowed us to sort of look at what else we had and kind of just go, okay, well, we'll do this one first since we have this, and then just work on them in this rolling basis as they came in. And that it didn't feel like anybody was like holding us up, or actually I was probably holding us up more than anybody because I kind of pushed my chapter to the very, very edges of, I sort of knew what I wanted to do with it, and then I went to do it and it took so long, but hey, made it happen. So it's in there. I joke that it's probably the least interesting one in the whole book, so I buy the book
like
for
all
everybody
the
else.
chapters. I like all of the chapters. I'm so pleased with everything.
Yeah, I really love our variety of themes. And we had one other thing I really appreciated about the book here is we had multiple chapters that were co-authored. So it's nice to see collaboration, because that's something people are always like, oh, we should have more co-authorships and collaboration. So I was really happy that some of those chapters came to us, like the Nino Cooney chapter with Jason Cody Douglas and Raina Dennison. TJ Losnicola and Brent Ferguson have collaborated multiple times at this point, both on conference papers and on publications, and so I feel like they've kind of honed their writing voice. And of course I know them from Ludo, so this may be true of the others as well. And then Maria Lorenzo Hernandez ended up bringing in, it was Armando?
Cousin.
Yes. Her cousin Armando, who had more of a music background, because Maria came to us with more of an animation background, and they ended up with this really, really beautiful synthesis of those two areas of expertise in their chapter on Gree, which I was overjoyed to see that proposal come in, because I love that game, and I think it's hasn't gotten enough attention for how beautiful of a game it is, and just what an artistic achievement that game is. So that was really neat to see that type of collaboration happen with our various authors. So we had our editor collaboration with the authors as well, but then the authors themselves had collaboration, and it was really has this like community to it that I appreciate. Looking at my list here, what else did I want to make sure to speak to? Really, I think a lot of these are going to be incredibly useful for anybody teaching on any of these topics. But even if it's not a an animation or a video game class specifically. There could be somebody teaching like a gender and sexuality course that may really want to draw on that center section of the book. There are some, and that people don't shy away from more difficult concepts in a couple of these chapters. We do have warnings in the beginning, sort of stating where that needs to happen. But for being media that is often stereotyped as being not adult and not, more juvenile entertainment. We've both faced that in our fields. It was nice to see folks take on things that are in no way aimed at a younger audience and that are really grappling with some pretty intense issues of sexuality and representation. So I appreciated that we have a balance here. We have games that and animation examples here that are definitely more lighthearted, but really a lot of depth to the subjects covered.
Yeah, and I would say that again, I think we tried to not make them so that they were dumbed down in any way, but just make them accessible to other people so that it could be used for an advanced undergraduate course or something where you're trying to expose different kinds of scholarship to people, just to kind of give them a taste of this is what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's also just naturally how you and I both want to write, and how I think, especially Ludo, I don't know if this is true in animation as well, but I think the field as a whole really promotes not burying your ideas in overly complicated academic ease just for the sake of sounding smart and using the bigger words. There's a lot of intention behind any of that, which keeps it kind of accessible. And it's not that there's never any jargon or never any expertise and specialization happening, but as a whole, people can engage with the topics.
The animation studies that I've been a part of, it's actually a nice mix of not just people who are on the academic side, but also people who are producing animation. So you get a nice mix of those, different approaches just kind of built in to the animation studies to start with. So I think that also helps. I don't know that it informs me so much as it just is like, oh, I found a home kind of thing.
Yeah, we love seeing that at Game Sound Con, which the deadline to apply is coming up. Matthew Thompson and I are looking for interesting ludomusicological research for that, because that is very much a conference built on interactions of the scholarship in the industry. And unlike the Game Developers Conference, GDC, which is just, I've been once, and it's overwhelming and massive on a level that even like the triple conference, AMS, SMT, SEM, is not as big as the GDC is just like unbelievably massive. You feel like you get lost in it, whereas Game Sound Con is only people that do, voice acting, sound effects, music composition, implementation, recording, and the folks that study that. So there is a sense of camaraderie and bridge building that gets to happen in that space that I think is unique there. So if anybody has an interesting idea for that conference, especially if you're on the West Coast, send it my way.
I will consider it, because I think that is a couple of hours from me, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's in LA, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of hours from me.
Yeah, we'd love to see folks come down for it, because it's a really neat conference, and I've really appreciated getting involved with it. I was really happy Matthew Thompson invited me along to that. I've been lucky to have folks in the field say, "Hey, you want to do this?" So this book was like that, and Game Sound Con was like that as well. Yeah, it is nice to have that interaction, because so often the scholarship is really not interacting with the producers, especially if you're studying, long ago musics. The composers might not be with us, or they might not be anywhere near you. But now we can usually reach out and find composers, and they're still alive, and they can tell you about their process. And there's something special about working in these younger fields as well. So yeah, I've had up the list of chapters here. We have some really, really interesting things to assign. I can see the pairings even within the book itself, but I've already found ways of sort of pairing things. I had a video game class this semester where I was able to take the proofs and obviously the students knew it was a proof. It wasn't the final version, but we were able to read a few of the chapters this semester and pair them with things that are already out. So I was seeing a lot of very easy connections there. So maybe I'll have to post some of those ideas for people. Like, this makes a really good discussion topic if you just assign these two together, and or assign them in the same week if you have a class that meets twice a week. So some really, really wonderful things. I don't want to feel like I'm leaving anybody out. So I know I've mentioned a few chapters kind of specifically by name here. I was really interested in Ranke's chapter on Beethoven, because that one sort of came from the initial opening gambit of the chapter talks about a Google Doodle. So I liked having that in there, where I was able to find, I don't know if it was in the Wayback Machine, it had been, or if Google, you can like go back and find the doodles from the different days. It was a playable game about Beethoven, and it's really cute because he's like, his score goes everywhere when he's like rushing to get to a concert, and you have to put the score back in order by ear and get the musical snippets in the right place so that it plays. I have played that multiple times while I was working on that chapter. I kind of went back to it and was able to get that done. But it starts with such like a simple premise, and Google Doodle's kind of an unusual place to start, but it ends up looking at notions of the use of classical music in both animated film and video games and all the significations there, which to me felt like a really really nice take on things that we've seen like Will Gibbons work on in Unlimited Replays. Like we've seen some work on this idea of classical music, which is in quotes even in the title of the chapter, but from a very different perspective, a very like philosophy heavy perspective. Just making sure I speak to everybody's chapters here because they're fascinating. I want to make sure everyone is intrigued by every single chapter. Yeah. In the gender, sex, and sexuality section, we have Karen Cook writing on Xander P. Wifflebottom. I wasn't familiar with Drawn Together. Had you watched, or did you know Drawn Together much?
I knew of it. I have watched a little bit, but it's not my usual kind of cartoon, to be very honest. But it's fascinating. I really like the chapter. It's nice in that I think a lot of the chapters that we have come more from the video game side, and this comes much more from the animation side.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, it's kind of neat to have it start there, and then go. How are video games portrayed in some of these different things? And so it's that kind of approach, which I really like.
And especially, folks know Karen as a leader in Ludo, but also kind of our resident medievalist in the field. And so this, for folks that follow Karen's work, this chapter is like nothing you've seen from Karen. And so I think she had a lot of fun writing it, knowing that like it's a series that not as many people have necessarily seen. Karen has long had an interest in television studies, but I don't think as much of that has been published. A lot of it's been kind of percolating, and I don't know if there have been conference papers, but I know that as somebody who knows Karen very well, who has streamed with Karen for years now on Twitch on Thursday nights, part of the stream team, it was like I got to see a side of Karen I'd never seen before, and like this was so unexpected, and really thoughtfully done, like all of Karen's work. So I think that one's going to be a little surprising. But yeah, some of the humor in Drawn Together gets pretty raunchy. So that one definitely has a warning that like there are some topics, because that series was it Adult Swim? It's at least in
Yeah.
that style. Yeah, trying to definitely be at an adult audience, and there's some shock value in
Yeah.
some of the plot lines.
So I think that the chapter, the Koan Chan's chapter, that one was a little bit more at the beginning of like a whoa, hello, in
Yeah,
terms of the warning. But I mean, it was really well written, but it's just one of those things where you have to kind of be prepared for the very violent and very adult kind of topics that run through the anime and the video game.
yeah. Absolutely. And folks may remember that are in the Ludo side, this was accepted and given at one of the online North American Conference on Video Game Musics, NAFCOM. And so that, because I don't remember if we were on Twitch at that point, but that was something that, like, at the very beginning of the presentation, there were very careful and thoughtful content warnings given, because it's a heavy topic, but it's one that is done with a lot of sensitivity and exploring the violence and the trauma, and then the stark differences in sort of how these things are represented in the anime versus the game, the visual novel version of School Days. So I think that one, it's like when people ask me if they should play Doki Doki Literature Club. I don't know if you know that game. Visual novel that sort of starts out like it's a cute romance dating. You join a literature club with cute anime girls and you get to know them, and so you think, oh, I'm going to pick which one to date, and then it turns into this sort of fourth wall breaking horror game. At this point, it's not a new game, so I won't give any specific spoilers, but that one has some very intense, graphic, violent scenes in it, in order to sort of shock you out of your expectations of what a visual novel and a dating simulator look like. And similarly, if people are like, "Oh, should I play that?" I'm like, as long as you go into it with that understanding, it's definitely worth engaging with. But that is definitely a chapter that I think is foregrounded well in the both the chapter and in the intro to the book. But just be aware, and dive in if you feel like you're in a space to take that in. But it is fascinating work, and it is nice to see the increased emphasis on trauma studies, just even in the American Musicological Society as a whole. I've really appreciated seeing that sort of come to the forefront, and just all the ways that trauma gets theorized, like historically, in media, in disability studies. There's certainly room for trauma studies. So I've seen a lot of different facets to trauma in the last few years. So I think this one is very prescient.
Well, I appreciate, both this one and Karen's chapter in terms of just that we have that kind of material covered, because I do think that it's something that is an important topic, and that not only is it important, but in the papers that I've heard and the conferences that I've been to, that there's been a lot more discussion about these different kinds of topics. And so I feel like in that way it represents where we are as a field right now, which is nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of this stuff feels very of the moment. Kind of rounding out that section, mine is definitely a lighter take on gender and sexuality, really through the lens of almost looking at Dragon's Lair. I remembered playing it as a kid and thinking this game is incredibly difficult, and being sort of young for the depiction of, like, Daphne. I wasn't in an arcade in 1983, but it was still in the arcades by the time I was old enough to see one, but I was still kind of young for that depiction. But I definitely knew what was going on and sort of what was being promoted with her characterization, and so I knew that was going to be a piece of it. Just kind of looking at Daphne and her voice. I did a little bit with voice in my dissertation, and sort of thinking about sound and not just music. So I started thinking about the ways in which the soundscape and the music were gendering these characters and sexualizing these characters. And then just tying it all through this idea of like maybe the medievalism itself is playing a role in here. So I don't know if it works, but it's definitely not like not my heavier work. It's not something I had to heavily content warning. Luckily, it stays on kind of a lighter side overall. And then we also have Carmen Sandiego here. Some really, really interesting comparisons of the sort of Carmen Sandiego's sonic agency in the cartoon versus one of the video games, one of the PC games.
Yeah, and I like this chapter in part because it really does give a very different approach than some of the other ones. There's a lot of different feminist readings that are in there. There's a lot of different philosophical ideas, and a lot of different sources that I'm like, okay, now I'm going to look at this one. Oh, I'm learning new things. So again, a good chapter for even if you're not as much into all of the music stuff and you're just trying to learn about how all these different studies of liberal arts in general fit together. This is a good example of that.
Yeah. I thought it was really smart deployment of literature in that chapter, from a variety of sources. A favorite of mine just because it was so fun. I mean, they're all kind of my favorite in different ways, but I really appreciated Dominic's chapter on DuckTales. It's a fun game. It's a fun cartoon. The music is iconic. Anyone who's played DuckTales knows that moon theme is a favorite. Just across the board. If you go to like a MagFest, there will be people in the hallways jamming out on the moon theme. But what I appreciated about his chapter was it sort of doesn't take any easy approaches to DuckTales and its music. It's this really sophisticated framing of this is something that has come out in so many different forms over so many different years. And so we often talk about like retro game aesthetics. And so he develops this framing of retrospective versus retrocursive. So I think that one will end up being sort of useful for anybody that's interested in long-running franchises and sort of how games get re-released, remade, reused, everything, redone. And then that pairs beautifully with Ryan's chapter as well.
We have a lot of nice chapter pairings, as you said.
Yeah. Because Ryan, of course, is looking at Kingdom Hearts 3, and Kingdom Hearts 3 being long awaited for fans of the franchise. That has been a slow series to develop overall. We are up on Final Fantasy 16, and there have been more than 16 because there have been multiples of certain games and tie-ins and things. But Kingdom Hearts, fans have waited a long time for it. And so by the time the next one comes out, there's already all this history accrued around it, and all of this musical activity and game concerts and things like that. And so Ryan this is actually, I've told Ryan this before. I think Ryan has gone on record saying like this is his favorite thing he's written so far. I told him I think it's one of my favorite things I've seen from him. I think it's just a really strong piece. He had a very clear vision for it, and really contextualizes the music of the series, but he really considers, and this has been a broader project for him too, this idea of remakes, remasters, these ways that we've been grappling with our history in video gaming.
My dog is telling me that he needs me to pay attention to.
Okay, well we'll wrap up here, but just as we look at pairings here too, Matthew Ferrandino's chapter on Adventure Time, I think, is a nice pair with Karen's chapter, because those are two that sort of come from cartoons first and then look at how video games inform the cartoons, as opposed to being like, here is a cartoon adaptation of a video game, or a video game adaptation of a cartoon, as we see in so many of the other spaces. The Adventure Time is just a really, really fun look at sort of how both musically and graphically, and plot wise and Otherwise, these retro games are informing BMO's character and certain episodes of Adventure Time as a whole. There's some nice close readings of specific episodes in that one. And then our last two are also beautifully paired because we've got this anime thing. So, anime-driven nostalgia and gaming soundscapes in the Rurouni Kenshin, and then the Ni no Kuni renegotiation of the animation concept with Stacey Jokoi and Jason Cody Douglas and Raina Dennison. Those pair beautifully together. And it's just a strong volume. I'm really excited to see it come out.
Stacey's I like because it really is, considering the fans, and I feel like fandom takes, definitely in animation and absolutely in video games, there's such a strong, they play such a huge part in the way that sometimes even games are made, and certainly the way that people approach them. I know, for Cuphead, for example, that was one of the things. There was so much that came out about what people thought about the game before the game came out.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to see, again, that kind of focus on fandom and how fandom really relates to animation and games, and that's a strong point for me for hers. And the Ni no Kuni one just has, again, with the Japanese studio of whose name we're not sure how to pronounce.
Ghibli.
Yes. All those connections. That's kind of a nice way to kind of almost wrap things up, and because you have all those nice connections every there, and it really takes a lot of the other aspects of what we talk about in different chapters and kind of puts them in one nice package there too. So, as you said, really strong book, I think.
Really strong, and we were a piece of it, but really we got so lucky with these contributors.
Yeah, and I was gonna say I might be biased because I'm one of the editors, but I really enjoyed working on it. I really enjoyed working with you. I think that any of the chapters could be something where people could pick it up and be like, oh yeah, and this is something that maybe I would want to go into, which that might be saying a lot, but I'm hoping that might be the case for some people.
Yeah, and that's a moment where we had to be very concise with our footnoting and stuff. Our authors are incredibly thoughtful about deploying the literature, but definitely read into those endnotes because they will give you a lot of context and new spaces to explore, new areas to read. And, if you catch the error in my I found the error in my chapter because I was working it into a North American Conference of Video Game Music NACFGM presentation. I was making a video, and so I was rereading my chapter and cutting so I could make a short video on it. And it's such a simple error that I can see why everyone read over it, including me. I ended a sentence with just the word whole where I meant to use whole step. So, because I was talking about the Bach toccata and fugue in D, but the cue is in E minor, and so it's transposed up a whole step. It's clear from the context because I'm saying D to E, but yeah, I caught that, and then it was after we had submitted the final version, I was like, no. So I'm admitting now.
This is why I don't like to go back and listen to my old performances, because I always like, and that's wrong.
You're how many rounds of copy editing and other people? I had so many people look at that chapter, and it just goes to show you how easy that type of thing is to skip over, even if you're reading it aloud to yourself. It's just you spend so much time with it that. You're gonna catch little things, but I think for the most part, it's an extremely polished collection, and hopefully other people won't have the same issue I did. Part of it was, again, I always pushed my chapter to the side and looked at everybody else's first,
and I think that's one of the advantages that we had, again, that might be helpful for others in your audience, that while I have played video games and while I have written on some video games, it's not my super strength, and so in that way, it's maybe easier for me to catch some of the errors because I have to read it more thoroughly, and probably the same thing on your end where you
Yeah.
read some of the animation stuff more thoroughly because it's just not as much in your wheelhouse, even though you know some about it. And so in that way, again, we were able to kind of complement each other and maybe catch more of the things because we had to read it more closely.
Kind of puts you on the edge of your seat, like, oh, I better shape up because I got to bring something to the table here, and this isn't my area. So,
Yes, I need to sound like I know what I'm talking about. Yes.
but then again, we also had a really nice team at Routledge that did a wonderful job, was very communicative, and we were able to get this in progress. So,
Yeah.
despite my one moment. Honestly, if that's the only thing wrong in my chapter, I am more than okay with that. And I really think a lot of the other chapters are not going to have that issue because mine was just kind of a last minute, oh yeah, I guess it looks fine kind of thing.
Well,
So.
and yeah, just to echo what you were saying, Rutledge did a fantastic job working with us, and I'm really pleased that they took our manuscript and I didn't have any issues in terms of timing or anything crazy like, or those what kind of things that I've heard horror stories about from some other people of, that they suddenly wanted something different or that the timing was going to be totally different. So again, communication, as you said, I think has been key throughout the entire process.
Yeah, everybody was wonderful to work with, and I think the feeling was mutual with our contributors, but also I think Routledge enjoyed working with us as well, and it was kind of nice to deliver something that we felt was really strong and polished, and sort of have that reflect in the entire process with them. So
Yeah.
it's a beautiful book. It's out now. Have your libraries buy it in particular.
What I was going to say is, for those who maybe want to get a copy but can't afford it, ask whatever journal that you happen to know of if you can do a review.
Yeah.
Because you ask the journal for the review, and then the journal asks Rutledge for a copy of the book, so a review copy, and then you get to keep a copy of the book that you're reviewing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to do it. That said, the ebook isn't too bad. So if you really want like a physical copy, then yes, it is. It's hardback, and hardbacks are expensive. But the idea there is that binding will hold up a little better, and hopefully the libraries will purchase copies, make those available to students. I already know of a few that have had their libraries order it, so thanks in advance to those of you that have supported the book by immediately going to your librarians and requesting it. I will, of course, on Friday, as this is streamed, post the link in chat, make that well known and available. We will be covering a few of the chapters going forth on the channel in the next month or two. So next week is Ryan Thompson talking about the Kingdom Hearts chapter, the long-awaited, because we keep bringing it up like incidentally on stream for whatever reason. It keeps coming up in other conversations. So I know we're excited to finally cover that one. And yeah, we'll have a few more. Watch the Discord for the schedule, and we will move on to the summary portion of the evening. But let's give a warm thank you to Lisa for being here today, for helping bring this book into being, for asking me along for the ride and giving me this opportunity to sort of get a taste of the editorial process, and really learn the ropes, and hopefully be able to take that experience into creating more opportunities for everybody in the field, because that was really the most valuable part of it for me. Was making this space and having this relationship and this communication, and just really making something beautiful at the end of the day. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. It's truly been a pleasure to work with you, and also it's been lovely being on this. I'm not used to doing the whole streaming thing, so it's always exciting.
Yeah, I'll send you a copy of the VOD once the stream actually happens on Friday. And there will be a little more at the end because we'll talk about Cuphead specifically. And of course, then you'll have the chat preserved and everything too. You'll be able to kind of see it all in real time. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to cut the video for now.